I realized in writing this episode that this is the third episode I've done that has ended with a Wari intrusion. They were kind of a big deal. I don't know, we'll cover them maybe someday, I guess. Well, everyone, the day has arrived. After many requests and a lot of anticipation, we have finally made it to the Wari episode, and I am excited. The Wari are a fascinating culture, and their appearance represents an important milestone in Andean development that left a massive legacy across the Andes. Unlike prior highland cultures, which remained politically localized, the Wari built an expansive state that incorporated many different cultures and people. This is because the Wari weren't just a successful state, they were an empire, and the result of their expansion was a renaissance of the highlands. This success was embodied in exquisite art, radically new architecture, and even a new religious movement to boot. The Wari utterly transformed the highlands with their success and culture. Today, we are going to examine this fascinating culture and empire. Let's get started. This episode is brought to you by my amazing patrons. Not only do they support me financially, but they actually voted on and picked this awesome topic. Thank you all for sending me on this wonderful quest. If you, dear viewer, would like to support the show and suggest and vote on topics, you could do so on Patreon. And now, back to our regularly scheduled program. A few things to get out of the way before we begin. This is part one of 2 episodes about the Wari. I originally planned to knock this out in 1 episode, but then things happened, and before I knew it, the script was way too big for 1 episode, and I didn't want my poor little computer to explode when it rendered 90 minutes of epic edutainment. So in this episode, we're going to be talking mostly about the Wari origins, their architecture, art, and culture. As we'll see in this episode, Wari engineers and craftsmen were among the finest in the ancient world, and they produced breathtaking works of splendor and beauty. In the next episode, we'll talk about the Wari Empire and its rise and fall. If you are watching this in the future, you can simply watch the episodes back to back. Next, we need to talk about sources for this episode. Our primary source of information is archaeology. The Wari sadly left us with no written records nor any oral accounts, except for a few possible examples that we'll discuss later in the next episode. We have no idea what the Wari would have called themselves in the past. The name Wari comes from the modern name of the site where their capital city was located. That name in turn means honored ancestor in the local Quechua language. By the way, you'll often see this culture in sites spelled Wari with an HU, but I'm going to stick with the Quechua spelling instead because that's what's used by almost all the literature today. The city of Wari was originally called Viñaque when the Spanish arrived, but it's uncertain how old that name is. Now, we do have other sources that can shed light on the Wari, and those are accounts and ethnographies about the later Inca and modern Andean communities. As we shall see across these episodes, the Wari and Inca shared a lot in common, and using our much better knowledge of the Inca can help archaeologists interpret the archaeological record. While we're talking about the Inca and Wari, I want to issue a quick word of warning. It's very tempting to equate the Wari and Inca, and while there are many similarities, there are also many differences in culture, so please keep that in mind. Finally, let's look at where we are. We are going to begin in the Peruvian highlands, specifically in the Ayacucho Basin, over 2,700 meters or 9,000 feet above sea level, very close to where the modern city of Ayacucho is located. Now, this isn't the only place we'll be, because the Wari eventually built a sprawling empire that connected the jungles of the Amazon with the deserts of the Pacific coast. This gave the Wari access to a wealth of natural resources and knowledge, and as we'll see, the Wari were not afraid to flaunt this. With that out of the way, let's do a quick overview of the origins of the Wari. The Wari emerged in the archaeological record around 600 CE, at the beginning of what Andean archaeologists call the Middle Horizon, which lasted until 1000 CE. Prior to the Middle Horizon, in the early Intermediate period, the Ayacucho Basin was inhabited by a culture called the Warpa, the direct ancestors of the Wari. The Warpa people were spread out among a few hundred small villages throughout the basin, with a main city at Ñawinpuku. Now, don't get the idea that these Warpa folks were isolated hillbillies. They may not have been building cities on the scale of the Moche up the coast, but they were definitely in contact with their neighbors, and at least one in particular deserves a mention: the Nazca. The Nazca were living in the Ica and Nazca valleys on the southern Peruvian coast, and they're most famous today for the Nazca lines that they carved into the desert. Late Warpa culture displays an influx of Nazca influence, and this is most visible in Warpa pottery, which began to adopt new colors and vessel shapes from the Nazca coast. Keep this contact in mind because we're going to come back to it later. Despite not getting a ton of attention in the archaeological literature, the Warpa were actually doing some pretty impressive stuff in the lead up to the Middle Horizon. The Warpa invested a lot of energy into agricultural infrastructure, specifically canals and terraces. This infrastructure proved to be a very wise investment because at the end of the early intermediate period, political and environmental conditions really deteriorated. For those who watched our Nazca and Moche episodes, this will be old news, but for those who didn't watch that, a series of El Niños and droughts began to hit the Andes, and this coincided with increased contact, migration, and conflict with different groups in the Peruvian Andes. Meanwhile, the Warpa population increased steadily throughout the end of the early intermediate period. This is when the Warpa culture began to transition into Wari culture. New and distinctly Wari types of pottery and art began to appear in the archaeological record. But why this transformation now? Why were these people thriving when everyone else was getting gut punched by Mother Nature? As it turns out, those terraces that the Warpa had come to rely on proved to be very resistant to the drought, and this allowed the Wari to blossom. And blossom they did, by expanding across the Andes and creating a new political order and Peru's first empire. Now, we'll discuss Wari expansion in more detail in the next episode, but just keep in mind that the Wari built a massive empire across a good chunk of modern-day Peru. But back to Wari origins. During this transformation from Warpa to Wari, there's one important change that we need to mention. During this time, many old Warpa villages in the basin began to be emptied, and the population began to concentrate at one city, the city of Wari. This emptying of the hinterland is actually a similar pattern that we see in the development of other early large settlements, such as Teotihuacan in Mexico and Uruk in ancient Mesopotamia. This new city would serve as the great capital of a mighty empire, and so let's turn our attention there for a moment. But a quick word on the archaeology of the city of Wari. Despite its importance, the site has sadly had limited investigation. Part of this is because of its immense size. The core of the site is about 2 square kilometers, but judging from wall remains and refuse, the city probably stretched another 3 to 4 square kilometers. The site is also badly overgrown with cacti, which makes surveying difficult. Most importantly, though, the site was cut off from archaeological investigation for about 2 decades, because it had the horrible luck of being right in the backyard of the Shining Path movement in the 80s and 90s. Armed resistance and terrorism tends to keep archaeologists away. As a result of all this, we don't know as much about the city of Wari as we'd like. I mean, just look at the Wikipedia article for Wari. 3 paragraphs that I can fit entirely on my screen. What a travesty. Compare that with its famous contemporary Tiwanaku, and you can scroll through that Wikipedia article for days. Hopefully the future will see more detailed investigations, but alas, history is not always kind to history. My ranting aside, let's take a look at this city and discuss what we do know. Occupation at the site doesn't actually start with the Wari. Although most of the structures at the site are of Wari construction, a sunken court was excavated that dated back to Warpa times. It's also not uncommon to find earlier Warpa ceramics in deep excavations below Wari levels, so it's clear that the city predated the Wari. At the dawn of the Middle Horizon in 600 CE, the Wari began to expand the city, and 2 centuries later, it was a bustling cosmopolitan capital. Unlike other cities in the empire that we'll discuss later, Wari was not built on a master plan and gridded urban layout. This is likely a result of the very rapid and organic growth of the city. Archaeology has shown that the local architecture was constantly being torn down and rebuilt. At its peak, it was home to some 20 to 40,000 residents, but I've seen a few estimates that go as high as 70,000 and some that go as low as 10,000, so I think it's fair to say that more work needs to be done to dial in those figures. The city had houses, workshops, elite residences, and ceremonial architecture all enclosed by an impressive network of walls. The western side appears to have had a ceremonial area that includes religious architecture and tombs. One section, called Chekawasi, has what are believed to be elite tombs, possibly even royal tombs. One important type of building that appears repeatedly at the site of Wari, and in the ceremonial zone in particular, is what archaeologists call D-shaped structures. These buildings are designed in a D shape with the entrance on the flat side, which usually faces a plaza. Niches are recessed into the curved wall. The exact purpose of these buildings are not known for certain, but excavations of a D-shaped structure at the Wari site of Conchopada revealed smashed ceramic vessels used for brewing chicha, as well as several trophy heads, so it's possible that these buildings served a ceremonial purpose. But other D-shaped buildings have not yielded any such remains, so this might be an exception. Those D-shaped buildings are a big Wari calling card, and whenever they appear at other sites, it's because the Wari built them. However, the dominant architecture at Wari is based on rigid rectangular buildings. These are dominated by large compounds with various buildings and patios. Wari construction is usually characterized by field stones mortared together and then plastered over. However, there are many examples of finely cut stone construction at Wari sites. The city of Wari is no exception, and several structures built with precisely cut and fitted stone blocks survive. Wari buildings come in a variety of forms, so let's take a look at the popular ones, starting with the most common, patio groups. These are long, narrow rectangular structures surrounding an open-air patio. The space in the city would have been limited by the sprawl of these buildings, and as a result, they could only be expanded upwards, and there are examples of 2- and even 3-story buildings. Judging from the remains of crafting materials, finished products, and pottery, these were used for a variety of functions, such as material and food storage and food preparation. Serving pottery recovered from patios at other imperial sites has convinced some that these might have been occasional spaces for feasting. Because these rooms were very dark, sometimes completely windowless, it's doubtful that these were used as living spaces, but it is a possibility. Another form we see are niched halls. These buildings had no open-air patio, and they get their names from the trapezoidal niches built into the walls, similar to what we see in later Inca architecture. Not many artifacts have been recovered from these halls, but judging from the artifacts that have been recovered and from later Inca practices, it's believed that these may have been involved with ancestor worship, perhaps a place to store ancestral mummies. Andean archaeologist Dr. John Topic has suggested that these halls may not be a Wari original and may have originated with the Huamachuco culture to the north, since they were building similar niched halls before the Middle Horizon. If that is correct, it's an interesting example of the Wari borrowing architectural features from their subjects and neighbors. Wari planning is very different from what we see in a lot of other Andean cultures. To compare it again to Tiwanaku with its wide open spaces and grand public monuments, Wari architecture seems to be geared towards upholding a rigid order and separating different elements of the city. This pattern is also echoed in Wari provincial sites as well. So how did the Wari sustain such impressive urbanism? Let's pick that up by looking at what made the Wari so successful: agriculture. The Wari were extremely adept engineers, and they built very impressive agricultural infrastructure. Like other prior cultures, they made use of irrigation canals and reservoirs to supply fields and cities with fresh water. The Wari even constructed aqueducts to carry water over passes to their settlements. A good example can be seen at the site of Rumicolca in the Cuzco Valley. This Wari aqueduct, which was later turned into a gate by the Inca, moved water from a spring into the nearby site of Picalacta for consumption. I'm sure it also impressed the heck out of visitors. As cool as that is, what truly set the Wari apart from their predecessors was their innovation of terraced irrigation agriculture. Just a word of warning, most terraces that you're going to see in this video are actually better restored and documented Inca terraces. Surviving Wari terraces were either reused by the Inca or are in real rough shape today. Functionally, they work the same way, so there shouldn't be any issues. That said, the terraces weren't just walls and platforms on slopes. There's a lot of sophisticated engineering that goes into making terraces, so let's take a fun little detour so we can appreciate this novel design. To build a terrace, people would first create a foundation or dig down to the bedrock and then construct a slightly sloping retaining wall with a small drainage canal to allow excess water to flow out. At the bottom, they would create a layer of gravel and animal bones, followed by a layer of fine sand to allow for good drainage, before capping it with a layer of topsoil, anywhere from 50 centimeters to over a meter deep. This topsoil was carried from river bottoms to ensure that it was fertile. Once the soil was exhausted, it could be removed and replaced with new soil. This created a well drained and rich bed of soil on which crops could be grown. The design also prevented soil erosion, which is often a huge problem with terracing. But wait, there's more. Terraces also work to insulate crops from frost, which was very important when growing frost sensitive crops at altitude, like maize. The retaining walls would absorb heat from the sun during the day and then radiate that heat during the night to prevent freezing. This ain't your backyard garden project, this is A+ agricultural engineering. Terraces allowed formerly marginal and steep mountainsides to become very productive agricultural zones, sometimes even allowing them to grow 2 to 3 crops per year at lower elevations. If yields decreased in traditional agricultural areas, terraces could pick up the slack, and this proved to be a fantastic investment of labor and material. This was an incredible design that made a huge difference in the rugged Andean landscape, and as we'll see in the following episode, this was an important element in Wari imperialism. All this allowed the Wari to grow a host of crops such as maize, quinoa, various legumes, potatoes, and other types of tubers. This would have given the Wari a stable diet that would have been augmented by other game and fowl, as well as guinea pigs and different camelids for meat. The Wari, like the Inca, may have placed a lot of emphasis on food storage and food security. Remember, they had emerged in a climatically challenging time, and food security would have been a high priority. With their terraced agriculture, the Wari overcame the challenges of climate and geography to establish a stable food base. Let's shift gears from food and turn our attention to spiritual nourishment and discuss what we know about Wari religion and cosmology. Our knowledge of Wari religion and beliefs can be gleaned from their art, as well as ethnographies of native Quechua communities in modern and historical Peru. Before we dive into Wari religion, I want to discuss a few important concepts in Andean cosmology: dualism and kame. For the sake of time, I'm going to generalize a bit here. Just know that there's more nuance than this that we don't have time to get into. Kame is the Quechua term for energizing and creative force that allows the world to reproduce and rejuvenate. Dualism refers to the idea that the world is divided between competing forces, such as light and darkness, life and death, and male and female. Now, in a well-ordered world, these different forces complement each other in such a way that Kame can flow and regenerate the world. Thus, death is seen as something that is intimately linked with fertility and a necessity for new life. Different genders complement each other to ensure continued renewal. With that in mind, let's look at Wari iconography and see what we find. In Wari religious art, one figure stands out, and this figure is someone that will look awfully familiar to viewers of this channel: the staff deity. The staff deity is usually depicted from the front, bearing fanged teeth with vertically divided eyes. In each hand is a staff, although these can sometimes be atlatls or stalks of plants, and around the head are emanating appendages or streamers with different motifs. Now, it's worth mentioning that these motifs are both new and old. We've seen similar staff-wielding deities in the highlands before, most notably from the Chavin culture, but we've also seen sprouting heads in Nazca art, and that goes all the way back to Paracas art as well. The staff deity depicted in these Wari works is an amalgamation of elements from different places, and this iconography also shows local flavors and adaptations as well. Now, the staff deity may be the star of the show, given how he's always front and center of the scenes he's in, but he's rarely alone. He's often flanked with winged staff-bearing attendants that are almost always shown in profile, usually running or kneeling on one knee. Another figure that often shows up is called the sacrificer. He's usually depicted in profile with a fanged mouth, a knife, and a trophy head. My sources didn't say this, but I see a lot of similarities with this figure and other sacrificer figures in Nazca art. Perhaps there's a connection? I don't know. Now let's pull back and analyze all of this. We have elements of power, destruction, and sacrifice, but they are complemented with symbols of fertility and renewal. The staff deity and his pals may be shown with trophy heads and victims, but the deity is also shown sprouting plants and generating new life from his head and staffs. Remember, trophy heads have also been found at Wari sites, so this was an actual practice. The staff deity was a symbol of life and death complementing each other and ensuring that the flow of energy could and would continue. It shouldn't be a surprise that many traditional Andean communities today make offerings to ensure the order of the world so that new life can arise, and in many ways, the staff deity complex embodies this notion. We can also get a possible glimpse into the rituals surrounding Wari religion by checking out two other artifacts. The first are conches that were crafted into musical instruments. In this beautifully inlaid Strombus shell trumpet, we can see a depiction of the staff deity. Such trumpets are actually still used today by some Andean communities in ceremonies, and it's likely that the Wari made similar use of them over 1,000 years ago. The other intriguing artifacts are these so-called mirrors. Now, to be clear, these are likely not mirrors as we understand them, despite their familiar shape. While mirrors were made in the Americas from reflective metals and minerals, experts do not believe that these are examples of looking glasses. So what are these then? While their purpose isn't known for certain, Anita Cook makes a compelling argument that these are snuff trays used to inhale various substances, particularly the seeds of the vilca tree, a seed with potent psychotropic effects. Excavations at the Wari site of Quilcapampa have shown that the Wari were using the seeds of the vilca tree to create hallucinogenic drinks, so they appear to have been aware of its effects. Thus, the Wari priests or elites may have used different entheogens to communicate with the divine in special ceremonies. It's also worth noting that the mirrors shown here have religious iconography on them, which would suggest a ritual function. In fact, one mirror was reportedly found with a small copper spoon that could have been used to scoop various substances on the surface before inhalation. This is also very similar to what we see in Tiwanaku, where they used similar snuff palettes, so this may have been a feature of the staff deity cult. And speaking of Tiwanaku, a few of you may have already noticed that many elements of the staff deity complex also appear at Tiwanaku. On the Gate of the Sun, we can see the staff deity and his winged attendants in full splendor. What's going on here? Were the Wari copying Tiwanaku's homework? These similarities were noticed by early archaeologists, and in fact it initially caused early archaeologists to label the Wari culture as a highland version of the Tiwanaku culture. In time, later archaeologists began to realize that Wari culture was a distinct culture from Tiwanaku. But where does this common iconography come from? The staff deity complex appears to have been invented during the early Middle Horizon, and while it incorporated earlier symbols, this was something new that emerged simultaneously at Wari and Tiwanaku. Now, to be clear, this is very much an elite religion and imperial cult. Politics and religion were intricately linked in Wari society, as they were in nearly all ancient societies. How common people practiced their spiritual beliefs isn't well known, but we can get some idea by looking at Wari mortuary practices. Basic practice dictated that the deceased would be interred in a flexed or crouched position in a pit or stone chamber with offerings. The Wari continued the highland tradition of burying their dead very close to their living spaces, such as under house floors, patios, or on the edges of their settlements. Wari burials also show many differences according to rank or class. As many as 6 different ranks have been identified, which shows the importance of social and political rank in Wari society. Wari people also interacted with their dead. There's evidence that some tombs were opened so new bodies and goods could be interred. Some tombs even had small openings in the top that were likely meant to facilitate offerings, such as chicha or communication with the dead. This is very similar to what we see in later Inca society, where royal mummies were venerated, consulted, and provided offerings. The Inca dead had a very active relationship with the living, and there appears to be a Wari precedent for this. But back to elite culture. Religious and political imagery was propagated throughout Wari art, and so let's turn our attention there, starting with Wari ceramics. Many examples of Wari ceramics survive from excavated ceremonial offerings, burials, and the remains of pottery sherds. As we mentioned earlier, Wari potters drew a lot of inspiration from their Nazca neighbors down on the coast. 2 hallmarks of Nazca pottery are the brilliant colors that adorn Nazca pots and the fine black outlines with which they surrounded their designs, and both of these elements were adopted by early Wari potters. It's not difficult to spot the similarities. Wari pottery can be classified into many different styles, and while we aren't going to go through all of them, we're going to hit the big ones. Early Wari pottery from the Wari heartland is referred to as Ocros and Chaquipampa. These similar styles are characterized by orange and yellow backgrounds with curvilinear designs. However, by about 700 CE, there's an explosion of innovation in Chakipampa style pottery. First and foremost, this is when we see the staff deity complex appear on pottery. Apart from that, many new zoomorphic designs appear that depict a host of various creatures. Another form that appears during this time are what are called face neck jars. These jars always have a human face at the neck, hence the name. The face usually has painted designs on the cheek and face. There's some debate about whether these jars are portraits of specific people, or perhaps represent a generalized ethnic identity. These jars show us very detailed depictions of Wari elites and priests wearing elaborate mantles and tunics. One specific figure does appear on such pots, and scholars refer to him as the paramount warrior. He also appears in two-dimensional representations as well, and in these, he's usually armed with a shield and bow. Around 850, a new style called vinyake emerged, and ceramics in this style are often hailed as the peak of Wari pottery. This style is characterized by pottery that was clearly manufactured for ceremonial and religious purposes. One of the most famous types of vessels from this time are what are called lyre cups, so called because their shape is reminiscent of lyres from the ancient Mediterranean and Near East. These are usually decorated with supernatural faces and most likely had a ceremonial purpose. Urns from this period also have incredibly fine decorations. Other vessels represent effigies of animals. Among my favorites are these llamas. Which of you wouldn't want to pour out some wine and impress your guests with this guy? Influence from the coast is well documented during this time, and one place that this can be seen is in double-spouted vessels that appear in many Wari tombs on the coast, no doubt a carryover from early Nazca double-spouted pots. Further north on the coast, the city of Pachacamac also lent important stylistic influences on the Wari, notably in these Pachacamac-style vessels, but they also imported an important motif to Wari pottery. This image, which scholars refer to as the Pachacamac griffin, appears in a lot of vinyake ceramics. Like a Western-style griffin, this animal combines avian features with a feline body, either a jaguar or a puma. Older motifs still continued, however. The staff deity complex was still going strong. Even people on the coast, far away from the Wari heartland, were producing pottery depicting the staff deity. Some motifs did change, though. Potters began to depict the paramount warrior wearing tunics and a four-cornered hat in effigies made out of clay that were not pots but statues. This example here has holes in the hands to presumably hold some sort of object, like an action figure would. Speaking of the paramount warrior, death and warfare are also common themes in Wari art. Depictions of trophy heads, warriors, and weapons are common and suggest that warfare was an important part of life in Wari society. As informative and beautiful as Wari pottery is, one could argue that the Wari placed much more value on their textiles. Wari textiles come in a dazzling array of patterns, colors, and clothing. Wari tunics, hats, sashes, bands, pouches, and even gloves have survived. The finest of these are decorated with elaborately woven designs depicting various geometric patterns, animals, and religious symbols. Weaving was done primarily with dyed camelid wool and cotton on backstrap looms, the weaving implement of choice throughout the Andean world. Some fabrics could also be decorated with featherwork. Although surviving examples are very rare, what does survive is absolutely stunning. These iridescent and gleaming feathers attest not just to the extraordinary skill of Wari craftsmen, but to the reach of the Wari Empire, which likely brought such luxuries from the lush tropical jungles of the eastern Andean foothills. The pinnacle of Wari textiles, however, are tapestry-woven tunics. Now, the term tapestry is important because a tapestry is something specific. Tapestries are not painted and not embroidered. They are completely woven, but not like regular fabrics. Rather than weaving continuous wefts across the warp threads, tapestries are plain woven with many discontinuous threads of different colors to produce very intricate patterns and pictures. As you can see in this picture of a modern tapestry weaver, that involves an enormous amount of planning and labor. What's more, many of these tapestries were finished on both sides, and in those cases, the design had to be exactly the same all over again, in reverse. Several tunics also display very systematic methods of distortion on their designs, which allowed the artists to be playful and reconfigure the imagery on their tunics. These instances of distortion are something wholly unique to the Wari. No other examples from any other Andean cultures are known to exist. But what were these garments used for? These would have been elite garments that would have communicated status, rank, and proximity to the Wari ruling class. Sleeved tunics, for example, are believed to have been reserved for the elite, judging from their use of the staff deity across the design. The designs on these tunics showcase animals, geometric designs, and elements of the staff deity complex that we explored earlier. Now, I realize that some party pooper out there is probably thinking, so what? And that's fair, because I realize that not everyone is a chic textile nerd like me. That said, allow me to point out that we live in an age of industrial textile manufacturing, where you can take an image, turn it into a pattern on a computer, and have a machine make it in minutes. We are incredibly spoiled people who will never know the eternal drudgery of spending every spare moment of our domestic lives spinning fibers into threads so that we can make our own peasant clothes. So I hope everyone understands that these tapestry tunics were the result of gigantic investments in labor and material. The process of making one of these was resource intensive at every stage of manufacture. Simply put, these are incredible works of art. Textiles were not the only material the Wari used to adorn themselves. Jewelry and accessories give us another view into Wari craftsmanship. The Wari continued the long Andean tradition of working precious metals, and there are many examples of Wari gold and silver jewelry. One common artifact found in burials are tupus, which allowed women to pin their tunics. Ear flares are a very common artifact, and many of these demonstrate exquisite craftsmanship. While metal ear flares do exist, the most famous ones are very precisely inlaid with a whole panoply of precious materials. These inlays utilize different shells, such as purple mussels, mother of pearl, but especially the highly prized red and orange spondylus shells from Ecuador. But they didn't stop at using shells. They could also use lapis lazuli, serpentine, turquoise, pyrite, copper, and even gold and silver. These could have a whole host of colors and texture. Some are even elaborately sculpted into figures like this example. Now, ear flares aren't the only items that the Wari inlaid. There are many other examples of inlaid works. My personal favorite is this standing figure. Just look at all the details and colors here. He's even got his own ear flares, and they even put silhouetted llamas on his tunic. I love it. At this point, I'm sure you're undoubtedly impressed with Wari culture, but don't get the idea that Wari culture was completely uniform across the empire. Many local cultures and art persisted, but Wari art was created to promote the Wari imperial agenda. Although a lot of the art we examined in this episode came from outside the Wari heartland in different corners of the empire, it's useful to think of Wari culture as a cultural covering over many different people. The fact that this art did have the geographical reach that it did should give you some appreciation for the Wari's vast reach. Where the empire went, so did the staff deity, Wari engineering, tapestry tunics, and fine feasting vessels. Consider for a moment the enormous effort that went into building settlements, buildings, and terraces, and producing art and religious paraphernalia. The Wari took their cultural agenda seriously, and other people took it seriously too. Even in areas where Wari culture wasn't adopted wholesale, it's easy to see Wari influence in the local art. Now, I do want to hang a little asterisk on that because there's actually some debate about the exact nature of Wari expansion, but we're going to dive into that can of worms next time. Spoiler alert, I'm on Team Empire. For those watching this on release, the next script is already done, and that next episode should be coming out soon. And in it, we'll explore how the Empire grew, how it functioned, and why it collapsed. I apologize again for breaking this episode up into 2 parts. If you are watching this in the future, you can just ignore this and click on the next episode and pick up right where we left off. But that's going to wrap us up for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and if you would like to support the channel, you can do so on Patreon. The link will be in the video description. Don't forget to subscribe and follow us on Facebook. Take care, and we'll see you in our next episode.